While remaining in this meditative state, I'm going to read for you the English translations of a few verses from the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. So I invite all of you to take these words into your heart. Feel them in your spiritual eye as intuitive guidance coming from your own soul, from the Guru within us. Not just hear those words, but feel the vibration of the sacred scripture. This is 40th verse from the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. In this path of yoga, there is no danger of unfinished business, nor are there latent within it the opposite cancelling effects of duality. In this path of yoga, there is no danger of unfinished business, nor are there latent within it the opposite cancelling effects of duality. Even a little practice of this religion will free one from dire fears and colossal suffering. Even a little practice of this religion will free one from dire fears and colossal suffering. In this yoga, there is only one direction. The reasonings of the undecided mind, caught up as it is in duality, are endlessly variegated and ramified. In this yoga, there is only one direction. The reasonings of the undecided mind, caught up as it is in duality, are endlessly variegated and ramified. O Arjuna, Vedic rituals lead not to oneness with God, nor do promises of superior pleasures in the astral world. All these lead rather to repeated rebirth. O Arjuna, Vedic rituals lead not to oneness with God, nor do promises of superior pleasures in the astral world. All these lead rather to repeated earthly rebirths. Those who, incapable of discriminating between right and wrong, seek personal power, they cannot achieve the inner equilibrium that comes through meditation. Those who, incapable of discriminating between right and wrong, seek personal power, they cannot achieve the inner equilibrium that comes through meditation. Let's sit for a couple of more minutes, taking those words deep within into our consciousness. Feeling the eternal wisdom of the sacred scripture. Okay, friends, this is our fourth week together, the last week, and I know we have been exploring Karma and Dharma the last 2 weeks, and I'm going to touch upon some concepts which we didn't have time for in the last couple of weeks, and also talk about yoga a little bit. And if there are any other thoughts or things that you want to share or explore more through the lens of Gita, I invite your comments as well, and we can discuss more as a group. Before I start, I was leading here last week when we were having the discussion on Dharma, but we ran out of time. I want to go towards the end of Gita and read a few more verses before I start commenting on them. The Gita is pretty direct, and especially Swami's commentary of it, so often it's just helpful to just read the English translations and sit with them, even more than anything else. We were talking about Dharma last week for a brief recap, to review things that we have been looking at in the last couple of weeks. So you can see on the whiteboard here we have Karma and Dharma. As we have been looking at it these last 3 weeks, both these concepts, both of them, we look back at the Gita to understand them in their essence, because it is, of course, the pinnacle of Indian scripture, and this is the scripture from which these concepts originate. This was clarified by Krishna, when the last time we were entering the Kali Yuga cycle from Dwapara. So we are exactly in that same level of consciousness right now in this planet, in this day and age. So these concepts were clarified by this great scripture, by this great teacher, one of our gurus, for us to have the right perspective and to apply them in our own lives. And both of these words, we are talking of Sanskrit words. They can have many English connotations. Oftentimes we translate it differently. For example, karma, we looked at as on the most literal level, it is action and its effect. That's what we call karma. On a subtler level, it reflects the movement of energy itself, because the action is not the karma. The energy created by the action is actually karma. And on even a subtler level, the way this is a reality, because when we just call it energy, it sounds abstract. It sounds as if it's not substantial. Somehow it is dissociated from the individual. But that's not the case. Karma is energy, but it's also helpful to visualize or understand karma as latent seeds, so that because there's a tangible reality to it. There is an association with the individual and that energy, and that's why we think of them as seeds. And at the end, towards bringing it all together, we understood karma itself as tied to us through our identity with the ego. Because all of karma, all this seed, all this energy is bound to ourself, our sense of identity, because we are still identified with the little self, with our body, mind, and the ego. And that's what keeps us bound to what we call karma. And karma itself, we didn't get to discuss this in detail in the second class, but karma is not just individual in nature. Karma is tied to ego identity, but that is not to say karma is always individualized. Karma can be broader than the individual. There can be karma to a situation, there can be karma to a family, there can be karma to a city, to a country, to this whole world. So there is karma on all the different levels. Now, just to dwell upon that before I move on, this concept can be a little bit confusing, and I don't have any better way of explaining it, and Swami himself does not make it too mathematical in the way he talks about it in the Gita commentary, because you start to wonder, how does it all equalize? And Swami would give the example of somebody being in a plane and having a plane crash. So does that mean that everybody, let's just say there was a plane crash and nobody survived, whoever was on the plane, does that mean every single soul in that plane reached that point in their karmic trajectory that they were bound to actually suffer a crash and leave that body? The answer is honestly yes and no, because it is not that there was a precise karmic trajectory that led each one of those souls into that particular exact situation. There was certainly a karmic momentum for them to be there, otherwise they wouldn't have been there. But at the same time, there was also a larger karmic wave, perhaps related to one or two individuals there, perhaps related to the airline or whatever the situation was, that was so overpowering that these individual karma was overshadowed by this larger wave of karma. I hope I'm making sense. And it is important to understand, because human beings have such a sophisticated ego. Most often our karma is very, very individualized. Sometimes, Swami even talks about trees and pets and animals. I often watch these, very interesting, almost poignant videos of rescuing dogs and cats. I don't know how many of you have seen these videos on the internet. They're very sweet to watch. And you look at it, you sometimes watch these videos of this one puppy being rescued, and then you think about all these other puppies. Somehow, this one puppy that has no legs and it needs to be in a diaper all of its life, and it cannot eat, it needs a special chair. And there is this loving family that actually adopts this puppy, and then now this puppy has, the life that one wouldn't even imagine possible, living such a fulfilling life despite all the obstacles that it was given. But hundreds of puppies like that which have such issues, obviously in the world that we live in today, it's not possible for them to get that opportunity. They're probably put down. If a puppy has severe issues like that, if it needs diapers or if it needs special care like that, they don't all get those families. So do the puppies what is the karma happening here? This one puppy that was so handicapped and that has this ideal family that it is found, and all these other puppies that may be fairly healthy and may be perfect pets for somebody, but they're strays in some third world country and they're struggling for food all the time. I was in fact watching a video not too long back of again, one of those videos where one of these dogs had gotten stuck into a plastic can or something in its head, and this person was tracking with a camera this particular dog, and this dog, boy or girl, I don't know, he or she had this can around its head for 8 or 9 days. So he couldn't drink water, eat food, and finally the rescuers got to, and the dog was saved. But somebody noticed this dog. The dog had the karma to be noticed in that way. The dog had the karma to be rescued in that way. You cannot but wonder, maybe there are other dogs that nobody's noticing. Maybe there is a situation, it's not, somebody is making a video of it and putting it on YouTube, and there's a whole story that is touching your heart, and it's worth sharing. But also it is easy for us to understand and imagine that there are so many other dogs that are not in that particular predicament, that are facing a different end. So what determines? In truth, animals don't have that level of sophistication in their ego to have karma that is so particular. It is often the karma of a situation or of the human person themselves that they intersect with that leads them in a particular direction. It's not necessarily the most comforting thing to hear, but that is the truth. Human beings, on the other hand, are very, very sophisticated. Now, when I say sophisticated, what does that mean? I mean, we have such a developed ego, and we have the ability to objectify our own existence. That's what distinguishes a human person from an animal. Even very evolved animals like chimpanzees or other animals that are so close to the human life, we can objectify our existence. We can look back at those, those days of when I went to school in Southern California and the sunny mountainsides that you can have nostalgia. You can think about other human beings and have compassion, all these, poor children suffering in Somalia, or what can I do for them, or just put things in perspective. We can step back from our reality and be able to look at the world from an objective lens, which animals are not capable of. And it has to do with a lot of subtlety. It has to do even with the fact that we have a straight spine, that we have the ability to experience ups and downs as flows of energy in the spine that have an element of choice in them, whereas in most animals they are completely dictated by their instincts and their circumstances, whereas in humans we have a lot of control over that. All that is slightly besides the point, except that karma itself expresses differently and is experienced differently depending upon your relationship with the ego. Depending upon how we relate with the ego, there is a different relationship with karma. I remember reading a story from the Indian scriptures. I can't exactly quote the details right now. But this was, a sage who was a small boy, and he had poked a moth, and he had put it on a stick and played around with that moth or something like that when he was 3 or 4 years old. And he is standing in front of the god of death. He's called Yama in the Indian system. And this boy is being asked, and God is saying, you have been a very, very pious and noble person, but when you were 3 years old, you did this act, and you have to pay the price of it. That karma is still unfulfilled. And then this man says, but they say that the karma that as a child, before you have reach a certain point, you become a brahmachari. That's how you go through the ashrams of life in the Indian system. These kinds of acts do not count. And then the Lord of Death responds saying, but then you were actually aware. Although you had not formally entered that ashram or stage of life where you were taking personal responsibility for your actions, but you were aware. Some other 3-year-old may not suffer the repercussions of that, but on the other hand, you were aware of what you were doing, and you were aware of what suffering meant to that moth. So your acts have a stronger, deeper effect. The fact that this man was more refined meant that he was going to suffer more consequences. It is what, when Yogananda once said, talking about Larry Marshall, he said, all the other gurus were so lucky. They lived in a world that did not have war. Whereas Yogananda himself went through 2 world wars. In his lifetime, he lived through 2 world wars and the Korean War and other wars. There was a lot of warfare, in the 1900s when Yogananda was in the West. He, in fact, took the first flight after World War I, the first boat coming to the West. And he spoke about how much suffering he himself went through because he lived in a world that was going through war. So the more refined and expanded our awareness is, the more we feel, the more we experience, and on a karmic perspective, the more the repercussions are when we veer away from that alignment with truth. So when the correction is stronger because our consciousness is more expanded. So I'm coming back to this whole idea of karma not being individualized, because in the case of animals and plants, Swami said they don't have any individual karma. Although they are individual beings, a tree might be an individual being, it does not actually have an individual karmic trajectory. It is interesting to think about. The karmic trajectory of a tree is determined by the forest it's in, the trees around, and the weather, and what happens, the human inhabitation that might be there, whatever else that's happening. So the tree does not go through the same karmic, it does not sow the same seeds or reap the fruits the same way as humans do. And of course, there's gradations of it, and in animals, there's a little bit of that. There's a little bit of cause and effect in the level of an animal, but nothing comparable to how humans experience it. And even on the human level, because our ego is not the master of the universe, because we don't control every single piece of our own environment, not all of our karma is individualized. Master made a lot of statements. It given the condition of the world that he lived in, he talked about how, Germany was going to, the karmic wave that Germany created through World War II will have to come back, and that country has to suffer. And he spoke about Russia and communism and Stalin and all of that. And he even said interesting things. I think I quoted it in this class. He said, the repercussions that Stalin will suffer are 1,000 times more than Hitler, because that karma was personal. He was responsible for all the harm that he perpetrated, all that he did in that country, whereas Hitler, on the other hand, he said he was an agency. Although people might think of him as an evil person, he was not a pious or a noble man, but he was a representative. He was an agency for energy that already existed in the world at that time. Because of his consciousness, he tuned into that vibration and he powerfully channeled it. So there's a lot of personal repercussions for him. At the same time, the wave that he was channeling will actually affect a larger reality, the country, the community, a lot of other things. Even today, and it's not just individualized with that one soul. He even talked about America needing to pay the price of the atrocities against the native people that were in this land before the European invasion. So you think about all of that, you realize that there is our own karmic trajectory, what has brought us into this particular situation and where we are headed. And at the same time, there are all these factors that are not always in our control. So there is karma in all those different states. And, I think in Ananda, I'm not going to say the name of the person because I'm not sure, but somebody's mother, I think it was Anandi, but I'm not sure, maybe one of you know. Her mother was supposed to be on one of these flights that had a plane crash. She was going to come visit Ananda, and I don't remember who it was actually. It was somebody in the 70s or 80s. But in the last minute, this person from Ananda, this devotee, had an intuition to call her mother and say, I don't think you should come. Please, just take my word for it. You have to get a different flight and you have to come at a different time. And her mother was so shocked, she was upset, and she did not board that flight, and it ended up being a flight that crashed. So sometimes there is that power of individual karma also, where we have, our karma trumps the situation, and sometimes the other way. We cannot really say how the actual unfoldment of the tapestry is going to happen, but it's just important for us to understand that there is both sides to it. And the more evolved we get, the more God is in charge. As Swami Kriyananda put it during the times of the lawsuit, the law of averages says, when some things don't go in your favor, some things will. And when everything is going against you, it's just defying logic, it just means Divine Mother is in charge. So ultimately, that's where it all comes to, as we were discussing again when we talked about karma. Ultimately, we come to this place of understanding that although some of these things feel random or outside of our control, when we are tuning into truth itself and we are living from that place of centeredness, we realize that there is still that divine will that is guiding our life. Nothing is outside of that. Things may be outside of the particular karma that we landed with. Things may be outside of our understanding. Things may be outside of what we read a situation, how we read a situation, but nothing is outside of divine will. So the divine will is something that equally encompasses all trajectories of unfoldment, whether or not they feel particularly in alignment with our own karmic path or trajectory. Now, going back to Dharma, this is the part that I wanted to touch upon last week and we didn't have time. Towards the end of the Gita in the 18th chapter, I read that verse where Krishna says, offer all your Dharma up to me and you don't have to worry about anything else. But he also talks about, we discuss Dharma as the course of action or the way of thinking again. Dharma, just as karma has all these different layers of how we interpret and understand it. On the most literal level, Dharma is right action in any given situation. What is the right thing to do? And what does that even mean? When you say right action, obviously, when you're committed to truth, then that also becomes duty. Because right action and commitment to that is our first and foremost responsibility. On a deeper and subtler level, we realize or understand Dharma as our own way towards liberation, towards enlightenment, because that is always putting us in alignment with a greater reality. That's what Dharma is. And that's what we reviewed last week, where the highest Dharma, as presented by the Gita, is alignment with truth, is always being in attunement with God and Guru, which again, for those of us on a spiritual path, that becomes the pole star more than anything else, because on a worldly level, there may be many ways to read Dharma or apply it. But for those of us that have consciously embraced the spiritual path, there isn't a lot of thought that needs to go into the specificities of it. Of course there is, because we have to take decisions on a day-to-day basis. But on an overarching level, our Dharma is pretty well laid out. I do want to read some verses from the Gita on Dharma, which I didn't get a chance to last week, because these are some of the verses that people find hard to actually grasp or to deal with these ideas, and they're very important, especially the way Yogananda explains. I'm going to read English translations of some verses from chapter 18. This is verse 46. One attains perfection by offering his own special gifts up to him, out of whom all beings were manifested, and by whom the whole universe is permeated. One attains perfection by offering his own gifts up to him, out of whom all beings were manifested, and by whom the whole universe is permeated. Verse number 47. It is better to fail attempting to follow one's own dharma than to succeed in following the dharma of another. It is better to fail attempting to follow one's own dharma than to succeed in following the dharma of another. One incurs no sin in trying to fulfill his own duty. One incurs no sin in trying to fulfill one's own duty. O son of Kunti, Arjuna, one should not abandon the work dictated by his own nature, even though the works contain some imperfection, for all undertakings, even the best, are marred by blemishes, even as a flame is obscured by smoke. O son of Kunti, Arjuna, one should not abandon the work dictated by his own nature, even though it may contain some imperfection, for all undertakings, even the best, are marred by blemishes, even as a flame is obscured by smoke. This is an extremely important teaching from the Gita, one that underscores the understanding of Dharma in a way that is actually applicable, with everything and every day of our life, because this is the part that is often difficult for people to work with, where Krishna almost sounds dramatic. Krishna has a lot of dramatic phrases in the Gita, throughout. His imagery is pretty extreme because he's trying to convey a point to Arjuna, and he says, it is better to just die trying to do your own dharma than to do somebody else's. Why is it so dire? Why is it so dire for us to understand what is our dharma and not pursue somebody else's? Swami Devi shared a story once. Swami Sachidananda, for those of you that grew up in, that were alive in the 60s or 70s, I'm sure you know, he was a great Indian teacher who was very well known here in the US. He was very, very famous. He was a very saintly soul. And he was a friend of Swami Kriyananda, and he visited Ananda village quite a few times in the early days, in the 70s. And once they were in the satsang, and after the satsang, people were asking him questions, and Devi said, this was in the early 70s, so very early on, Devi had just come to Ananda. And she went to him almost seeking some piece of personal counsel. She asked him, Swamiji, how can I make sure I continue making spiritual progress throughout my life, that I always keep growing spiritually? And she said, Swami Sachidananda became very serious. He looked right into her eyes and he said, never compare yourself with anyone. And that's it. That's all he said. Never compare yourself with anyone. Of course, that may have been a particular advice he gave to Devi in that context, but it is applicable for all of us, because our view of spirituality is often a little bit delusional in terms of how we see the projection, how we see the whole trajectory of the growth, because we imagine somehow spirituality to be two-dimensional. There is this point of, these are people, all the terrorists in Taliban and all the mean people in Wall Street, and here's Swami Kriyananda and all these other people, and I'm somewhere here in between them. And then without even our awareness, as we go through life, we often keep calibrating on this two-dimensional line. Oh, that person feels very, very spiritual. He must be over here. It's not something we do consciously, but it's a sort of an unconscious habit that we have. we don't understand that we are comparing. We are actually pitting an inner reality on this external scale that we don't fully understand. Oh, this person, wow, look at this person's behavior. Clearly they cannot be that spiritual. They have a lot of lessons to learn. So he must be somewhere here. We sort of keep calibrating because we don't quite understand that spirituality is so much more multidimensional than our rational minds can ever grasp. It is so multidimensional that we don't quite know what karmic trajectory has brought somebody to this point. What are they really working out in this particular moment? Where are they headed? We don't quite see all of those different faces and the whole picture that the masters can see. Ramakrishna, who was a great avatar who lived in India, he was so down to earth and he was so childlike by his own nature. And Asha often quotes the story. The people who did theater, a lot of artists and artisans who were involved in that kind of art, they were not considered refined in India in those days. Oftentimes, even the women that were in that profession, they generally were not in married relationships. It was a different kind of a setting where the artists themselves, they would have multiple partners, or they had a different lifestyle. And these artists were very refined in their art. It's not like it was a reflection on their art or anything else. And Ramakrishna was so childlike. He often, sometimes they visited him and they would speak with him. And in fact, one of his disciples, Girish Chandra Bose, was from that particular line of work. He himself was he was a heavy drinker. And later on in his life, of course, he abstained from alcohol. But when he came to Ramakrishna, everybody was just so surprised. Why would he allow somebody like this to enter the ashram, let alone counsel him, take him as a disciple, care about him so much? This man is constantly drunk. He's so inebriated even when he comes to see Ramakrishna. Why would he be talking to him? Anyway, once a group of these theater artists came to meet him and they left. And Ramakrishna could feel the judgment amongst his close disciples because he was a priest in this temple of Dakshineshwar. And then he said, those artists are so refined. You have no idea how close they are. They have so much focus and energy and will that they have learned to master. The moment they realize how to direct it towards God, they will get there in no time. So he was saying that almost in an instructive way to other disciples. You might have so many more lessons to learn than they have. You just don't, it doesn't look like that from the outside. That's obviously an extreme example. But when you think of Dharma and, finding your calling, following your own truth and all these things, we have to understand that it's so much subtler than what it looks like on the outside. That one's own dharma, one's own trajectory is not an outer reflection. It is alignment with one's own inner truth, that everybody is walking their own spiritual journey. You can get there only by walking your journey. You cannot go there by following somebody else's path. Spirituality cannot be defined from the outside. It is to always be inside out. We have to always ask, what is my dharma? It cannot be assumed. It cannot be assumed that, one should be a renunciate of this kind, or one should not be pursuing this because this is considered materialistic, or one shouldn't be doing that. There are so many examples, not just from scriptural characters or mystics or saints, but even practical aspects of our own life and people that we know that we can think about. Spirituality is sometimes complicated. Like I said, it's very, very multidimensional, and this question of dharma is at the center of all of it, because there is a karma that has brought us to some point. That's where the verse that I just read, where he says, I missed the page. By offering one's own special gifts, there is a certain karma that we have built that has brought us up to this point, and we have gained. There is a lot, as Norman was speaking with Master, and Master was counseling him, when he was felt burdened by his own karma and all the challenges he was facing. Master said, one has to have very, 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 very good karma even to want to know God. So obviously the fact that we are all here, and if you're watching online or wherever you are, the fact that we are even interested means there is this huge momentum of positive karma that has brought us up to this point, which means we already bring a lot of gifts. A lot of gifts, not in the sense of, those kind of individual talents that we think of, but maybe talents, but gifts in the sense of soul lessons that you have already learned. That realizations that we have had, otherwise we wouldn't be interested in the same way in something as serious and as deep as this. That we have already learned many, many lessons, and all the fruits of that good karma is what has brought us to this point. And now we work with our own nature. We work with those strengths that we already bring in and those deficiencies that we are trying to fulfill. And that's where we come to this question of dharma. And we have to fulfill it in exactly the way that is right for our journey. And life will keep correcting and guiding us, whether it's a guru that is instructing us or life itself, as Yukteswar Giri said when Kumar left him because he fell into bad habits. In the autobiography of Yogi, Yukteswar Giri said, the world will have to be his guru for some more time before he can return to the ashram. I don't know whether he meant a few decades or a few incarnations, whatever it was. Of course, Kumar was very close to Yukteswar. Yukteswar cared about him very deeply, but he was not ready for the guru in that way. But it is also comforting. That sounds almost like a hopeless statement that Yukteswar Giri said, now I cannot take care of him. But honestly, the comfort in that statement is, even if you don't have a guru, the world will guide you. The world is a guru. I mean, all of us have a guru here in this room. I don't know who's watching online, but so we do have a guru who we are tuning into. But even if not, even if you have people in your life that don't have a guru, we don't have to worry about it, because the soul's own innate desire to expand and our aspiration to grow in that direction, that pursuit of happiness, what Master spoke about in his very first book, that is guiding us from within, and that is going to magnetize to us all the right lessons that we need in order to break the boundaries that are limiting us and making us suffer. So in that sense, the world always continues to be our guru. In the introduction to God Alone, the life of Jnanamata, who was a great saint, it's interesting. Jnanamata, I think, if I'm right, she met Yogananda when she was 68 years old. That was the first meeting. And she moved into or at least in her 60s. I believe she moved into Mount Washington to live in the monastery almost in her late 70s or maybe even 80. It was pretty late in her life that she moved in to live in that hermitage. But of course, Master said, after when she passed away in his eulogy, he said he looked at her entire life and he couldn't find a single blemish. Even before she was consciously pursuing a spiritual path, it didn't look like it. She was just this lady who was growing up in Seattle. She was not interested in men. Then she found this husband. She was a professor in law, and she had a son who had some issues. She was interested in all these new age things. She was just seeking in her own way. And then Ray, who was her son, he found Yogananda's teachings, and he told his mom, you would love these teachings. You should meet this man. And one thing led to another. Very late in her life, she finds Yogananda. She finds her guru. She develops that relationship. But Master said, even until that point, throughout her life, he couldn't find a single sin, a single blemish, which means she was already in that place of purity. The world had already guided her. And Jnanamata, in her own words, she says, even though I had not met her guru, I'm paraphrasing here, even though she had not met Master, she said, I always lived life with this understanding that everything that came to me was coming from a higher source and it was coming for my own growth, for my own good. So that is discipleship. Whether or not she had recognized Yogananda, whether or not she had met him in that lifetime. So in that sense, I am saying all of this only because we not only hear guidance from our guru by our own attunement and by community and being with each other, but we are also being told, we are also being guided by our own life situations. Well, you wanted to live in this house, but guess what? You're not going to get to do that. I know you really, really wanted this job, but you didn't get it. So what does that imply? All that it implies is, well, it's not my dharma. There's no other way to it. Of course, maybe your dharma is to prepare for the interview again, apply in 2 years and go back to that job. It's hard to say one way or the other, but everything that is coming to our life is like an autocorrect on what our dharma is. One doesn't have to go to the Himalayas to meditate and find what one's dharma is, because life itself is constantly correcting us. Life is constantly telling us, a little bit to this side, a little bit to this side, not right now, maybe later on. Oh, not there, not that, maybe not this relationship, maybe not that house, not that job. Life itself will constantly keep correcting us. What we have to do, calm, acceptance, and joy, that's what we say every Sunday in the Festival of Light. We have to pause at every juncture and realize that everything that is coming to me is coming from a higher source, and it's coming for my own good. It is coming so that I can grow. And that's where we come to this understanding of what it means to fail in one's own dharma. You know, that is itself a rather dramatic statement. It's better to fail one's own dharma, or rather die, rather than pursue somebody else's dharma. Because what does it mean to pursue somebody else's dharma? What it means is that we start defining spirituality outside in. That we get into mental concepts of what it means to grow spiritually, what it means to expand, and then we superimpose that external understanding into our own inner reality, which is not the way it is meant to be. That we start comparing ourselves. Oh, maybe I should do this, maybe I shouldn't do that. You know, that person, you know, I would just do so much better if I had a dedicated meditation space in my apartment. I would do so much better if I didn't have to drive 1 hour to my work. I would do so much. As soon as my kids leave for college, I would be I would be able to meditate regularly. If as soon as I get this back pain fixed, I would be able to go so deep in my meditation that everything is going to be great. We keep wishing that somehow somebody else's karma, somebody else's dharma is going to fit us better than our own. We imagine that this particular situation, this particular relationship, this particular lesson, this particular is somehow not fitting us. You know, it just doesn't feel right. Maybe if the shirt was a little tighter in the arms, maybe if it's just a little looser in the waist, it'll fit me better. But you know, Divine Mother knows better. You know, whatever it is, that's why Krishna says. And this is again the important part of understanding Dharma and this verse itself. Again, to go back to what Krishna says, it's okay, you don't have to succeed. You don't have to feel perfect in this dress that you're so uncomfortable in. You can fail. You can fail in being able to fit into that dress. It's okay. Just don't wish for something else. You're not, the bar that is being set for you is not one of perfection. It is one of awareness and acceptance as a mode of transcendence. That's really what is being presented here. In fact, this verse comes at the end of the whole caste system, and there's a lot of other things he's talking about in terms of recognizing, those of you that are looking at Letty here, that know the education for life philosophy and how you work with children. You know, all children are equally loud in Living Wisdom School, or at least I'm sure the teachers try their best. You know, every child is different. Every child is different. They are at a different stage. This child is more physical. That child is more sensitive. This child is more artistic. This child is more feeling oriented. This child needs to calm down a little bit. He's too restless. This child needs to just get up and walk a little bit more. So every person's dharma and karma is different. Almost, I've read the book only once, long time ago, but I've heard my friend Arjuna, he always inspires me to study education for life, because he often talks about how it is so applicable to all of us, whether or not we work with children, because it is a great guide on how we work with ourselves. Because it's much easier when you do that with children, but a little bit harder when we do it with ourselves, because in our own self, we don't have that same level of acceptance to really know, you know what, this is what is easy for me, this is challenging for me. Let me work with my strengths, and let me find ways to cope and improve upon my weaknesses. Just being aware of that and not always wishing that things were other than they are. Whatever that is. This person, with children, it is what it is. This child is more artistic, let her do more arts. This guy just needs to run around, he needs to play a little bit more. Let him do more sports. Whatever that is, we are able to see that more objectively when we look at children, but with ourselves, especially, not just even with partners and friends, it's perhaps easier. But in our own lives, it is not as easy. That question of dharma is often tainted by what we wish it were. It is often tainted by what we imagine things to be, or our own mental understandings and the comparisons that we are constantly drawing. And that's why Krishna is being dramatic in his expression by saying, it's better you die and you fail in whatever it is that you're meant to do, rather than try to do something that is not yours, rather than wishing that something else was your job. Master's own life and all of his disciples, each disciple, the way he spoke about them, it was all about that. He spoke of Durga Mata. Durga Mata was, of course, as most of you know, she was an advanced disciple of Yogananda, and he would often give her very odd projects. He wanted her to sculpt the statues of the gurus. He wanted her to he wanted her to learn how to fix a car. And then he wanted her to build his first motorhome. And she learned everything. She had no experience in any mechanic work. And then when later on, after many years, not even when she did that, he said, you lived so many incarnations in just a short span of time. You learned so many lessons, because these were the lessons that were holding you back. It would never occur. That's why, when you are in such proximity to that vibration, things get expedited and you clearly become aligned with that truth and dharma. But, I wouldn't probably choose to work on a motorhome and build it myself, not in a million years. But who knows? Maybe if I was in that alignment with truth, that's a random example, but sometimes things are not as obvious. Maybe that's what I need to do as my own next step, to learn or overcome some significant obstacles in my own spiritual life. Things just don't look the way they are on the outside as they are inside. And that's why this teaching becomes very important, where Krishna says, you have to meditate on what your dharma is. And you have to think about it both in the internal and the external. In the external, there's not much to think about. The project is rather simple. Like I said, it's calm, acceptance, and joy. Whatever situations we are put in, like Swamiji said, what is your dharma? If it's in front of you and you're next in the line, it's your dharma. And that is not as complicated a question. We start to notice things that are around us. We start to notice, where is my energy being called? What are the projects given to me, whether it's my own family, at my work, in my own spiritual life, whatever it is in front of you. If I were to completely step away from being this person, if I were to step away from my preferences, my whims, what would this channel of energy like to accomplish as an agency for my guru? When we are able to look at it objectively in that way, that gives us an understanding from that external perspective. And in our own hearts, in our meditation, again and again to consult, to ask that question, what is putting me in alignment with truth? What is my lesson? Because things also come to us that way. We have to approach it from both sides, to observe objectively and understand what these situations are and where our energies are being called, but also meditate on it, to think about, what is my next step in my own spiritual life? Your next step may not be a change in job or doing something different. Your next step might just be, maybe doing more Om technique or whatever that is. It could be something that we don't think of as being that significant, but that may be our next step. And to constantly pay attention to that, what is my dharma? Because we make spiritual progress only when we are following our dharma. Because dharma is that road that has been carved out for our own enlightenment. And this idea of discrimination itself, and that's why in the first verse that I read from the second chapter, Krishna often refers to it in the Gita. He does not give us a real guidebook except giving examples. He always talks about the difference between right and wrong as if it's obvious. In fact, the whole conversation is happening because Arjuna couldn't tell the difference between right and wrong. But oftentimes Krishna would just casually say, you should be able to separate right and wrong. You need to be able to discern. What was the word? Let me pull that verse again that I just read from second chapter. Those who are incapable of discriminating between right and wrong, they are not able to make spiritual progress. So that level of discrimination is a form of attunement. It's not analysis. It's not simply knowing something we don't know. It is not more information. But it is a state of attunement with ourselves and with our own higher self, that is, and with that greater reality, God and Guru, that we are tuning into, which is all the same. I'm just stating it differently because we want to become in tune with who we are in our own next step. And both karma and dharma require that discrimination and discernment in order to be able to work with it. Again, at a different place, I don't think I spoke about this in the class on karma. Krishna distinguishes, in talking about the gunas, he talks about karma itself as being of three kinds. He says, I'm sure all of us have heard this many times in Sunday services and other teachings, because it was a verse that Yogananda wrote a lot about, and Swami often spoke about it as well. In one verse of the Gita, he talks about how the true perception of the soul is obscured either as smoke that is obscuring the fire, as rust over a mirror, or baby in the womb. So oftentimes we even casually make references to it. Maybe it's a baby in the womb, maybe it's smoke on the fire. What he's talking about is three kinds of karma, three kinds of delusions that we inherit from our past that are currently obscuring that attunement that we have with our own higher truth. And the three kinds, what are those three kinds? They are all aligned with the three gunas: sattvic, karma, rajasic. The karma are also differentiated in terms of what guna or mode. That's how it is translated in English. I don't know what better word there is. A guna is translated as a mode of functioning. Sattvic simply means sattva, or sattva guna is that which is is closely aligned with truth, which is pure, which is clear, and it is very, very close to the alignment with the absolute truth. Rajasic is the outward pull, it's passion and ego activating, and it draws us out into seeking and grabbing things from the outside. And tamasic is that which is darkening and dulling of the consciousness. Rather than seeking out and grabbing things outside, we just shut down and contract our identity. So these are the three modes, and everything in nature functions as a mixture of these three modes. Nothing is purely one or the other, including our own consciousness and everything that we see around us. It has a mixture of all three, and sometimes the tamasic is more than the rajasic, sometimes the sattvic is more than the tamasic. So that balance varies depending upon the situation, the thing, and it is obviously a function of time as well. It's not that everything is absolute and does not shift. Now, when talking about karma, Krishna says karma is of these three types. Sattvic karma, that which is simply a confusion that is not deeply identified, it is like smoke on the fire. It is, the examples of sattvic karma are just habit patterns which are harmless in nature. They're still karma, just like in the story of the Mahabharata, Drona, who represents habit, he does side with the Kaurava army, with the bad guys ultimately during the battle. So even simply habits, I always sleep on the right side of the bed, or, I like to have coffee first thing in the morning. It's not anything that is significantly holding you back spiritually, but still it is a form of ego entity that is affirming a limited pattern of energy. So that is still karma. So sattvic karma is like smoke on the fire, which is still obscuring that truth, but it can be blown away just by the puff of, breathing air. It doesn't have to take a lot of effort. Rajasic karma, on the other hand, is rust on the mirror. It is still obscuring the mirror. It is something that is that is putting us out of alignment with that truth and with our own inner reality, but it can be overcome by effort. It's going to stay there unless and otherwise we make the effort to clean it. But as long as we keep scratching, we keep putting more energy, you just scratch very fast and you scratch continuously, it'll be gone, because there is the pure reflecting mirror underneath the rust. So Rajasic karma is that which requires us to put energy in order to overcome. And examples of Rajasic karma could be anything, I'm restless in my meditation, or have this particular desire for this, I want to make more money, simply even something as broad as that. All that is Rajasic karma. There are many ways to fulfill it, either by fulfilling or by realizing that it is something that we don't need. Both of that happen in a state of balance, but that is overcome by effort, by us putting out energy and then learning the lessons that come to us as we are working through that energy. Now, Tamasic karma, on the other hand, he calls it baby in the womb. And for any of you that are mothers, I'm sure all of you are aware of babies in the womb. You cannot decide when they come out. The baby comes out when it wants to come out and when it's ready to come out. And when it's ready to come out, you cannot stop it. The baby will come out no matter what. So Tamasic karma is such. It doesn't matter. You cannot put more effort to get rid of the baby, or get the baby out, not get the baby out. And even if you want to hold on to the baby for longer than its period of maturity, you won't be able to. So these three kinds of karma, and Tamasic karma, sometimes we say that even in life, sometimes we look at certain things, whether it's in our own personality or in others. These are not things that we can necessarily shift just by putting energy. Grace is something that stands outside of all this and can certainly rescue us out, but it is not just a function of our willpower and energy. Oftentimes, addictive behaviors are examples of Tamasic karma, because there is a fundamental distortion of perception that is in that individual. And it is not just a question of believing, trying, doing this or doing that. Even if that person is able to overcome that for a certain period of time, if that seed is still there, they succumb to it again. And even if they're able to successfully hold it at bay for one lifetime, they might not have overcome that. They might have made progress, but still the baby is in the womb. And until the baby is not ready, they are not over it. And of course, grace can relieve us of that karma anytime God wishes, and so prayers and grace always helps. That's why even in the 12-step program, the idea of grace and the idea of being rescued and saved by that is such an essential piece of how people overcome such obstacles in their life. Now, the reason I'm quoting all of this karma, and also in the context of dharma, is it requires discernment. How do I know? How do I know that this challenge that I'm facing right now, is it smoke on the mirror? Is it rust? Is smoke on the fire? Is it rust on the mirror? Is it baby in the womb? There's really not a sure shot way to tell. I don't know. This prayer is attributed to Saint Francis, but I'm not sure. As they say, Lord, give me the strength to change the things that I should change, and the patience to accept the things I cannot, and the wisdom to know the difference. We are talking about that wisdom. How do I know that discernment? Where do I get that discernment to know what should I do? How do I approach the situation? How do I work with myself? And that's where we come back to this attunement with the higher reality. Just as I'll probably end at the same place where I ended last week with that verse from chapter 18, where Krishna tells Arjuna, in essence what he's saying is, you cannot do this yourself. You cannot do this yourself. You have to surrender to me. You have to take refuge in me. You have to seek help. You have to offer your heart. You have to offer everything that you are into that flow of grace. You have to ultimately draw upon a higher reality. There is no way to work with either of these concepts, karma or dharma. That's where Gita leaves us. Because it's important for us to understand, it's important for us to work with these ideas, but there is no way we can do that simply by the power of our own will or of the ego, because ultimately it all comes to that discernment, which is a function of our attunement with the higher reality, which again can be drawn only through devotion and by the act of constant surrender into that higher reality. So these ideas are important for us, the way we approach, the way we look at each situation, because ultimately we are, as Yogananda's prayer, that is considered the guideline on this path. I will, I will act, I will reason. So we are willing and thinking and reasoning through all the things that come to us in our lives, but there is no accomplishment that can come through any of that until that will and thought and activity was all guided from a higher place, because that's the only way we find that alignment with truth. So I think I'll end there, but I'll open first before we move on to the activity. If there are questions or comments, Kamala Devi will lead us in an activity. But if anybody wants to share something, ask something, or say something before we move on.
Thank you for sharing smoke on the water, smoke on the fire, and rest in the mirror, and baby in the womb. That's so cool. I've never heard that before.
Oh, really? I'm going to repeat it because it's not recorded on the mic. Somebody in the room was just appreciating the imagery of smoke on the mirror and smoke on the fire, rust on the mirror, and baby in the womb. You know, honestly, the first time people are exposed to that image, the baby in the womb is not, again, a comforting image because, and I feel like it has to do a lot with, no offense, it is also a Western mindset in a certain sense, because there is such commitment to the power of the individual that it's often a difficult idea to comprehend that I cannot do something just because I put my mind to it. But it is in fact an idea. Perhaps in India there'll be other things, you know, for them the baby in the womb is easier for them to grasp than something else. But you know, I've often noticed that in the West it's more foreign an idea than one might think, because it's hard for us to comprehend. I say West Asa because even if some of us grew up in India, we all grew up with Western education, and the world is all one small village right now. But in that sense, we believe in the power of the individual, and it's just even to imagine that just because I put my mind to something, why wouldn't I be able to do that? As Master said when he came to the US and he was comparing US and India, he said, in India, people always say, oh, God realization, I have all this karma, I need grace, I have to grow in all these ways, it's too much, maybe in a future lifetime. And then he comes to the US and he says, Kriya Yoga, I can take you to God. And everybody say, great, tell me how, I'll do it. And Master appreciated that attitude. That's what we need. It's just like, tell me how, let's do it. Any other?
Just a little bit.
Oh, sorry. When you're talking about serenity prayer, it's just, letting go. And how hard it is to let go. And in a way, Dharma kind of teaches you that aspect of it. And karma is part of that.
Yeah.
I guess that energy?
Yeah. Karma is the energy. It's the context for everything where we are finding ourselves in this moment. Somebody in the room was just saying the serenity prayer is the one that I shared at the end. Is that is that by Saint Francis? Maybe.
Is that what?
That's the 12-step prayer.
Oh, it's a 12-step prayer.
It's an 8.
Oh, I see. Got it.
But I also heard it somewhere else too. But
Yeah, I've heard it in multiple contexts.
You can use it towards anything that you have in your life. And it's a very powerful tool to kind of bring you back to center.
Yeah. And I think if we were to take anything from the Gita as the moral, just to add one more layer to the serenity prayer is calling it just the wisdom in itself does not suffice, because it almost makes it sound like, of course, in the right context, I'm sure whether it's AA or somewhere else, when people have the right understanding, it would be presented in that way. But it is important when you're just reading those words to understand we are not just talking about a function of me, me. Because this is something so beyond us, the wisdom to know the difference. That wisdom is not here. That wisdom comes from here. That wisdom is an alignment with a higher reality. It's not just an individual product. And that is also is the essence of where the Gita leads us. That's why Dharma is the way to enlightenment. But honestly, once we are all here, Dharma is surrender. Dharma is seeking refuge in God and Guru. There's nothing else to it. Because what else? Once we have that, then we have that alignment, then we automatically have that wisdom. We'll be acting from that place of wisdom and knowing of what is what. So, thank you. Anything else?